This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 467, Config Action System. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. On today's show, we're talking about the Config Action System, what it does, and how it helps with Drupal recipes with our guests, Alex Pott and Adam Globus-Hoenich. We'll also cover the events recipe as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guests today are Alex Pott and Adam. Alex started his Drupal journey on Drupal 5, eventually becoming a core contributor to Drupal 7. During the Drupal 8 development cycle, he quit his job and focused on the new configuration management system, which led to him becoming a Drupal core maintainer, which he still is today. Outside of Drupal, he likes going on adventures with his family, friends, and guitar. Adam does all kinds of Drupal stuff. He works on the migration system, media system, lightning distribution, parts of automatic updates, and has worked a lot on core in general. And now he's been working on the recipe system and Drupal CMS. He knows things. Alex and Adam, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are Nathan Denzow, principal consultant at Denzow. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
And also joining us as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hi. And here's Ryan Price to tell us a little bit about the Northwest Drupal Summit.
Ryan Price here to tell you about the Pacific Northwest Drupal Summit. It's happening October 11th through 13th, 2024 in Seattle, Washington. This is a unique migratory camp that happens between Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, British Columbia, and it's the first time it's happened since the pandemic. We have a full program. On Friday, we're going to be having 2 trainings with a professional module development by Drupal Easy, as well as an introductory Drupal training, and a contribution room. On Saturday, we have a full day of sessions, and we have a whole building to ourselves, so that'll be really fun. And on Saturday night, we have our social event. And Sunday, we have another half day of sessions, and then you get to hang out and see Seattle. It has some really great sights, great food and drink, easy access to mountains, waterfalls, the outdoors, and a great music scene. So head over to pnwdrupalsummit.org. Call for papers is open now, and registration is opening maybe by the time you hear this. No flannel shirt required.
Thanks, Ryan.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted to set up and configure a robust event system in your Drupal website in just a few seconds? There's a recipe for that. It's called Events, and it was originally created as a project in March of 2013, then a distribution, but it was reborn as a recipe in July of 2024. It has a 1.0.0 Alpha 3 version available, which is compatible with Drupal 10.3 and 11. It is actively maintained. There is no stable release, so it doesn't technically have security coverage. There is documentation in the works, and it has one open issue, which is a bug. Usage for recipes is not tracked by Drupal.org, and obviously the maintainer is yours truly. Listeners will probably not be surprised to hear that Smart Date is at the heart of what you'll get when you apply the events recipe. It will provide an event content type and a view to list upcoming and past events. The recipe will also set up add to calendar links on your event page, making it easy for site visitors to be reminded of when your event will take place. There are companion recipes to add a calendar view, to be able to associate locations with maps, and to add event registration. A modified version of the events recipe has already been integrated into Drupal CMS, so it will be even easier to apply for a site based on that. Internally, it makes use of the create if not exists and set components config actions, which is why I thought it would be relevant to today's discussion. Let's talk about the events recipe.
I think this is great. I feel like this is one of the first use cases I thought of for recipes. My question is actually based on the last thing you just said, or the second last thing you said about the modified version. When you're dealing with recipes, how easy is it to tweak specific versions and have, one that's provided on Drupal.org and one that's part of the Drupal CMS?
I would say, in my experience, the changes needed for bringing them into the Drupal CMS are more about making sure that they play nicely with other elements of Drupal CMS. But at the core, a lot of the same things are the same in terms of like trying to figure out which things can be provided as sort of, simple config files versus which things should be implemented more with config actions so that they can be reapplied again and again to the same site.
So it's more, sounds like more of a testing thing than like change in your code thing.
Yeah, I mean, my experience, at least so far in creating recipes, is that there's a fair bit of trial and error. I feel like, the tooling around creating recipes, I'm sure will be improving in the coming months. But for now, there's definitely been some trial and error to get things working smoothly, especially with that idea of, item potency, which is, again, that idea of being able to apply things to the same site again and again.
I'm just thinking like there's tooling around creating recipes, because I thought it was all just manual, get in there with a text editor and know what you're doing.
Well,
there should be.
Kevin Quillen, who's been on the show, he did create a recipe generator, but I'm not sure that it's seen a lot of upkeep in the last year. So, it's probably based on an older version of the recipe system. And, having that updated would be amazing. There's also an issue open on the features module around having that potentially become the basis for exporting the configuration in more of a recipe format, as opposed to right now, which is more of a like module type of structure.
It's interesting because I played with creating my own recipe a couple of weeks ago, and I found that the recipe cookbook documentation that's on Drupal.org, or maybe it was on the recipes page itself, was pretty helpful in like guiding me down the right path. But yeah, Martin, I do agree that there was some head scratching as to like, do I really need this config? Which config do I need? And like, where do I find it and how do I copy it? And like, definitely some command line kung fu there to copy things into certain folders and whatnot. But I'm wondering, and this is more of a programming note than a module of the week note specifically, are we going to start seeing more recipes in place of modules of the week? Are we going to have to like change the acronym to like M or R OTW?
Well, I mean, listeners will probably recall that we've had themes, and I think once even a DDEV plugin as modules of the week. So technically not modules at all, but I don't know. We'll have to see. There's certainly a lot of excitement that I hear around recipes, and so I think as people create ones that are really interesting and useful, I definitely could see having additional ones that we talk about in this space.
I'm going to suggest we rename the segment to Drupal Thing of the Week.
Getting back to the actual module, I'm curious about the companion recipe for the event registration. Does that handle things like paid registration too, or is it just like people signing up for an event?
So the events registration recipe relies on it's technically called entity registration, but the machine name is registration module. And there are, I think, at least one, maybe even two different modules that provide integration between registration and Drupal Commerce. So there is definitely a path to be able to set up paid event registration through that.
Okay.
But it doesn't sound like there's a recipe for that just yet.
Not for the commerce side of things, although I'm definitely, if somebody's interested in helping that along, would love to collaborate on something like that. I mean, eventually, even things like the event platform, which is right now mostly a giant set of config, eventually I would see being ported over into a number of recipes as well. But that's probably going to be something I tackle later in the year.
So, wait, I thought this was the event platform. So this is another event-based recipe that you have?
I guess I opened that up. That kind of worms myself. So events as a recipe is different from the event platform, which is a separate project, really more around being able to sort of organize and host things like Drupal camps. And that we did an episode on that a couple of years ago, I think.
Yep,
so
we did.
This is just a recipe to add event functionality to your website. When you go into the event platform building, I'm assuming that you'll probably build that recipe as a lack of a better term, it's a recipe, but not like an install profile, right? So people can install a site with that.
Exactly. And even today, the event platform is not an install profile. It's a set of modules. And so there's probably a fairly direct path between the two, but there are some parts of the event platform that actually do also provide some PHP code. So those will have to be like moved out into separate projects and then, sort of woven back in through the like recipe.yaml files.
And then as a recipe, you could potentially even add example content to your recipe too, so that people could kind of get an idea of what the event platform might be able to do, right? The possibilities are endless. This is Drupal, people.
All right. As usual, Martin, great recipe of the week. So Martin,
Drupal thing of the week. That's what we're
Drupal
going
thing of the week.
There you go.
So if folks want to connect with you and suggest another thing of the week, what's the best way for them to do that?
We are always happy to get nominations for Drupal Thing of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
See you next week.
See you then.
This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. Let's talk about life after Drupal 7 end of life. Since August 2023, there has been a lot of discussion around Drupal 7's official end of life in January of 2025. It's no secret that many companies, organizations, and individuals are still on Drupal 7 and have yet to migrate. I think we can all agree that migration, while beneficial, is not always feasible, and this is where Hero Devs comes in. Hero Devs has partnered with core team maintainers of Drupal 7 to build and maintain the Drupal 7 never-ending support product, ensuring the same quality of support you have come to expect over the years. Drupal 7 Never-Ending Support, or NES, allows for an effortless transition, allowing your site to remain secure, compliant, and compatible after Drupal 7 goes end of life. This allows you to migrate on your own time or potentially not at all. Hero Devs promises to keep Drupal 7 alive and well, even offering support for the current top 100 Drupal 7 modules. If you'd like to know more about Drupal 7 Never-Ending Support, visit herodevs.com. That's HERODEVS.com. All right, we can move on to our primary topic. Alex, I'd like to, can you explain config actions, the config action system to us as if we are a fifth grader? What does it do?
Right. As a fifth grader, I don't even how old would a fifth grader be? Show my non-Americanness.
Like
here.
11.
Like 11. Okay, so to my son. Okay, what does the config action system do? It allows you to declaratively tell Drupal to make some change to your config. And by declaratively, what I mean by that is you say, I want this to happen. You don't there's no kind of like if this or that or any kind of programming logic to it. You are just like, do this. And it does it in a reliable and repeatable way. And that's why it underpins the recipe system, because that's what recipes are made up of is a series of things that you want to do to your Drupal, and many of those things that recipes do make changes to configuration.
So was recipes the genesis for config actions, or
100%.
Okay.
Interesting. So the config action system doesn't really have anything to do with the configuration system per se in Drupal. It's more of a method to update configuration based on a recipe telling it to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's its own part of the configuration API. So there's the recipes API, and that exists. I mean, if we just look at even just the Drupal kind of folder structure, that's in like Drupal core/recipes.
Mm-hmm.
Then that in order to support recipes, we didn't want to put everything in the recipes API if it didn't need to. We were really trying to introduce small, well-focused APIs that did the bits that we wanted them to, and only did those bits, and didn't kind of reach out into all the systems, because it makes it harder to maintain, it makes it harder to test. There's lots of reasons for that. And so when we were kind of saying, well, here's things we want recipes to do, it was obvious that there was a need a need to provide a kind of like set of steps, instructions to the configuration system. And we decided to name that system configuration actions.
So,
and we made it as part of the config API. So it's the action system is, I believe, in Drupal/core/config/actions.
so it's almost like a communication pathway between like recipes or maybe something else in the future into configuration.
Exactly. And it stands completely alone from recipes. It can be used by anything else, but the only use case we have at the moment in core is recipes. And we have another API like that, which was also part of configuration, and that's the config checkpoint API, which allows you to kind of say, I want to record this, that I was at this point of time in my config system, and then you can go and make a checkpoint in the future and take a difference between the two, rather like Git. And so that checkpoint API also exists outside of recipes, but is leveraged by recipes. Because one of the requirements for recipes was that we would be able to apply a recipe and something go wrong, and then be able to roll back the configuration to the point at which before the recipe was applied.
Interesting. So, okay. So you get an A+ for being able to explain that to a fifth grader, because I understand it completely. And, sometimes I think I'm a fifth grader. Anyway, so I'm thinking the answer to this next question is probably a no, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just to make sure we're clear here. So is the config action system related to the Actions UI module that was removed from Drupal?
No. So I kind of smile because, funny enough, I was just dealing with some contrib module that was still required, like the actions module, because it was using the action config entity, which is actually provided by the system module. So yeah, just to be nice and a little bit confusing, but no, the actions system inside of Drupal, that one, it's more of a kind of entity action system, but it can do other things. It's not related to config actions at all. Config actions are about performing actions on configuration. The actions, that actions other system is about it's about a plugin system that can be presented in the UI to like publish something when
Save, edit, that sort of thing.
Save, edit happens. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Or
got it.
send someone an email. Yes, they have similar names. But config actions is the thing, and actions is something else.
Nice. So I have not really followed recipes very much since it's been in active development. And I had no idea what config actions were until I saw the show notes the other day. So I think so far your explanation of the config actions system makes sense to me. Now I have some follow-up questions though, Alex and Adam, on the basically its purpose. And what's unclear to me is, what's the difference between exporting a set of configuration and using config actions? Like why are you not exporting a configuration entity in a YAML file, like serialized a YAML file in the recipe itself, compared to defining another system to manage distributable configuration?
Well, who's to say you can't? Who's to say you can't export a YAML file into a recipe? You can do that. It's just going to behave a little bit differently because the assumptions around it are different. When a recipe encounters a complete config, a completely exported config entity, it's kind of like, okay, I want to bring this thing in to the system exactly the way that it looks.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's something already in the system that looks different, I'm going to freak out because that's a conflict. I don't know how to resolve it. I don't know what the source of truth is. And a config action is a lot more, is not looking at it that way. A config action is really just like, okay, there's a piece of config. I want to make one small little change to it. I don't care what else it looks like. I'm just going to make this one little change, and that's it. So config actions have a little bit more kind of flexibility than than bringing in a fully exported config entity.
That is something I've been like craving as a Drupal developer for quite some time, trying to figure out. I've been working with this client for several years that wants to do all their configuration themselves in production, and using configuration management is very difficult because of that, right? Because they have an internal team that's doing config management, and I have my own team that is trying to manage configuration from a local development environment. And distributing changes across this 18-site multi-site is really difficult, because I feel like I'm back in Drupal 7 and lower, where I have to do a bunch of button clicks to deploy a bunch of config changes. But this seems like a very good candidate for a situation like I'm in now, right? So could I use recipes to distribute config changes using actions?
Alex, you want to take this one, because I got to say something not correct.
Not correct. Everything is correct, Adam. It's just some things are more going to end up in trouble than not. So if you're developing like a common feature for all of those sites, packaging it up in a recipe to deploy it across those sites is a great way to do it. If you're looking at managing all of those sites with two different teams working on it, at some point you're going to have to work out how to resolve your conflicts with config and come up with some sensible workflows to do that. Because there has to be some canonical sense of truth of the way that site is supposed to look. But yeah, I do think that in terms of maintaining a number of sites, multi-sites, where you've got similar features and you want to develop those features and be able to deploy them to those different sites, I think recipes are really going to help that situation. I also think it might be worth kind of just rewinding and just talking about giving an example to the use case of actions in recipes that Adam was describing, about why you wouldn't want to like have the whole of a config entity in your recipe. Where a lot of this started from is just the problem of maintaining roles and permissions, which is silly hard to do in terms of like many things wanting to make changes to the same role. So if you export a role, it's going to have all the permissions there. And so if a recipe contains like, I don't know, your like content editor role, and there can only be one of those content editor roles on your site. So the really basic config action is just to add a permission to a role. So in your recipe, you have like the role name, whatever it is, user.role.content editor, and then add permission. And if the permission is already there, it's like, fine, I don't care. If the role's there, it's great. You can have a create if not exists action to create the role if it doesn't, and then it can play nice with all the other recipes that want to do something to a content editor role that has nothing to do with whatever that recipe is providing. So an event management one or add to blogging one recipe can work together, because all they want is a content editor role, and they want to add their own set of permissions, but they don't really care what other permissions are there in the role.
Yeah, I really found that while I was building out my recipe, that like, and now talking to you guys, I kind of understand like behind the scenes what's happening is like those incremental or the subsets of config updates that you can make through building a recipe is really awesome. And the ability to say like, hey, I really like 90% of this config, but like, here are the 3 things that I want my recipe to change, right? Is super powerful. And, it sounds like under the hood, like we're saying, hey, recipes is doing this, but under the hood, it sounds like, the config action system is really doing that. And it's kind of playing, a mediator to like, hey, here's the config that's in place. Here's the config in the recipe. Like, can we merge them? Yeah, we can, or no, we can't, and like throw an error or do something else. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So I wonder, this might be a little bit advanced, and maybe it's really future, or maybe it's never, but one of the things I'm wondering is, can config actions be extended to allow you to modify a recipe that's coming in? And I can think of kind of 2 specific cases. One being like, hey, there's going to be a proliferation of recipes, and everybody's going to call things their own thing, right? So I can imagine a situation where I want to import the events recipe that Martin created, but I don't want it to use field_date as the date field. Like we already have a pre-existing date field. I want to get all the stuff that he has, but I just wanted to use the existing date field that I have that's already called field special date. If we could extend config actions, is there a way to be like, hey, if you see something called field date, whenever you see field date, just replace it with field special date? Or like roles, like maybe I don't use the content editor role. I use, editor 2, and I want the permissions, but I just want an the editor 2 role. And I could edit the recipe and change it, but if there's a way to specify that.
I mean, Alex probably has a different view on this than I do, but to me, that use case is what I would consider a destructive use case. And by destructive, I don't mean like you're a bad person for doing it. It's more just like the way recipes were designed to work is they're supposed to be able to build. They're like Legos. You can you can compose them, you can build them into a larger thing. The problem is that if you have one recipe that does one thing, creates editor 1, and then this next guy comes along and changes that, says, no, you're editor 2 now. Anything building on top of that can no longer rely on the presence of editor 1 because this other guy came in and changed it. It's like, oh, okay, it's not predictable now. So predictability is the foundation, to sound like kind of CSy about it, like predictability is the foundation of composability. So it's config actions actually are very, very limited in their ability to make so-called destructive changes like that. They can almost never do removing things or deleting things or uninstalling things. That's just not allowed because that would make them less predictable to other things that want to build to recipes that want to build on other recipes. So yeah, I guess the answer to the question is like kinda.
Oh man, you just opened up a question for me. I'm gonna hold on to it, but I also wanted to comment on what Nick said and what you said, Adam. Right? Is like, Nick, you almost have to like in your use case there, right? Like you're thinking too much like a developer, I think, because like in your use case, like what you would really do is you would just take Martin's recipe and make the changes you wanted to make to it to make it work the way you wanted to make it work, right? Like the way recipes are intended, right, is that it's more of a non-technical user that's not necessarily going to care what the field name is, right? They just need the functionality in Drupal. So I think like, for developers, like developers could take somebody else's recipe and manipulate it to have the field names that they want or work in some way that they can. And you can chain recipes together too. So you can have multiple recipes built on top of each other. But like, yeah, I think we just have to frame it in like how this is kind of used by the end user too. There's a certain level of developer that's just going to, grab it and kind of manipulate.
Well, to clarify, go ahead, Alex.
Well, I think what John said is correct. Like, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Is like, yeah, like that's not like you're altering like a recipe alter hook would make me throw my toys out the pram and probably quit the initiative. Totally, because it's the alterability of recipes would mean that we just the ground isn't stable, and and the whole point is we want recipes to be able to work together, and you know that they're going to work together. If someone can install like recipe chaos module and it can just go and like randomize what actions are being applied to what entity, I don't want to see that.
Yeah.
But that shouldn't stop. I mean, but the great thing about recipes is that they are just a YAML file. So if you do want to go take a recipe and then rip it apart and use it on your site to use that set of instructions to shortcut yourself to a new feature on your site, you're fine. And then you don't have to care about it. You throw it away because then you get the config in your site and you build on that config. You build on your site. You're great.
Yeah.
It's not recipes are not supposed to be, at least in terms of the way your site is thinking, as this thing that sticks around and you rely on forever. They are just a set of instructions of how to take your site from state A to state B and give you the feature that you want.
I just want to clarify. So I think you both gave great points on why that alter hook type thing would cause great pain and misery. But the use case I was thinking about more was I'm building a site for a client. That client is semi-technical and apply some features themselves, right? Maybe they're a really small business and they have some recipes. The idea behind it would be some sort of interface where you could be like, and I know, Adam, you've pushed back a little bit on this particular piece of functionality, but like, hey, you're importing this feature that has events. Like if you already have a date field and the person who created the recipe named the date field differently, like you don't want to have multiple date fields many times, or taxonomy fields, or taxonomy like if you have a tagging system already and there's a feature adding a new tagging system, you might want to just combine them. And so having some way to be like, hey, should we collapse this into one thing? Now, yeah, a developer can update the recipe to match however that site works. But I was thinking more of just like a way to make sure that multiple recipes are consistent across each other rather than
feels like over engineering to me, but I'm going to let Alex and Adam chime in.
Yeah.
I think it's just it reminds me of like James Gleick's chaos theory in butterfly wings. Like it'll spread really quick, and it will cause you more problems that you don't want your non-technical like business owner to be dealing with. So because it's the field name will be in a view, multiple views. The intent behind the date in one view will be it's slightly different intent. It might have an end date. It might not have, like the way the range is, if it's a range, how that's handled. Time zones. There's just all sorts of things that can get get tricky there and needs a careful consideration. It's not to say that it can't be done to like alter a recipe to work on that specific site. It's just saying that that job isn't something that can easily just be like magicked and altered in and presented and nicely on the UI, like swap out these entities for these entities. It's like a developer's job.
It feels to me like the kind of like 80-20 rule reversed, right? Like 80, like, hey, this module does 80% of what I want it to do. I'm going to build the 20%, right? But instead, like with recipes, we're saying, hey, this recipe does 80% of what I want it to do. I'm going to install it, and then I'm going to go correct the 20% of what it's not, not doing right. Or hey, now I have 2 date fields. Okay, let me reconcile this so I now have 1, right? So like it's getting you closer to the solution, but like there may be some it's going to be considered negative, but cleanup that has to happen, right?
Yeah, I think not including something like that is probably the right decision. I guess I'm just seeing the future where you get a new site and you find out that they've applied 14 different event recipes that are all just slightly different.
But I mean, technically, you're not going to know that, right? Because
you will,
recipes, there's no recipes registry.
Right?
Yeah, that's true.
But when you go to edit the content types and find out that there's 16 event content types, and they tell you, you have to use event 3 because that's the one that actually works, then you'll know.
But you can already find that on some Drupal sites. I've seen sites like that already. I don't think recipes are going to make us like better
no
configuration coordinators than we already aren't.
That's not really a recipes problem, Nick. I mean, that exists today, right? There are just people out there that are like, I need another field for this. Let me create date 1, date 2, and then date 3 is just a merge of date 1 and date 2.
Fair enough.
And if, funnily enough, actually, eventually when the config checkpoint system has a UI, or someone builds that in Contrib, then actually the experience of applying a recipe, going, hey, that's just added another event type, I'm going to roll back to before, it's actually going to be easier than it's ever been. So there is actually that side.
So that's different. That's different than config synchronization, like the config synchronization screen where you see the side by side.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It is. I mean, it uses under the hood. It uses the same code to synchronize between different config states, because obviously we don't want to rebuild that, because that I don't know if any of you have ever had the fun of, well, I know Adam has, the fun of working on the config importer, but yeah, That no one wants to rebuild that.
Yeah.
I'd love to re-architect it, but that's besides the point. But yeah, so under the hood, the systems are the same, but yes, there is you wouldn't see probably. I don't know how the UI is going to look because we haven't built it yet.
I think too, an important thing to point out for Checkpoint, correct me if I'm wrong, you can reset configuration to a known point right now, right? If you make some changes to your config and you made a mistake, you can roll that back by just importing the config that's on your system. The difference between that and the Checkpoint system, aside from being built into the recipe system, is that right now, if I make some changes to my config, I update a display mode or something, and then apply a recipe, the Checkpoint fails and rolls back, I should still have that display mode change that I made manually.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the recommendation probably before applying a recipe is to probably export your config, make sure it's right, and save that to disk, right? So that you have a point to roll back. But the rollback also will get you to whatever state you're in, even if it's not saved.
That's what the config checkpoint system does. Is it puts a stake in the ground in your complete site configuration at the point before you apply a recipe. So it's kind of like you've written it to disk. It doesn't do that. It puts some operations in order to make that a performant kind of operation. And then if you applied a recipe and then you went and did some other stuff in configuration, then you roll back, it would roll back those post recipe changes because it is the same as a config export. But yes, it does take it the time just before you start applying the recipe.
I think it also probably makes it simpler to add multiple recipes at once. Like if you're trying to see if like these 3 recipes do work well together, you apply one, apply the next. You can roll back any of those individual in the same order, but you can roll back any of those individual recipes. Without really having to worry about rolling back to whatever happened to be in your config file system.
Yeah. It makes it something that you can do through the UI because, of course, the real hope for the recipe system is that it's just as easy to use through the UI as it is from the command line, at least for applying and managing the recipes that you want to find and apply to your site.
It's clever. Okay, Adam. So we've gone a little far afield of the show notes already. So getting back to it. How do you think the average user will interact with the config action system when using Drupal? Because I think I know the answer to this based on our discussion, but let's make it clear.
Well, right now you don't. There's only one thing in Drupal that uses config actions, and that's recipes. So if you want to play with config actions, you should be using recipes for that. That is currently the only way.
And there's, just to be clear, there's no UI for recipes, right? You have to use command line tools, Drush or something like that.
Yeah, if you want to apply a recipe right now, you have to use the command line.
Okay. So short answer, if you are interacting with Drupal through a UI, you're not going to interact with the config action system. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, you won't know you're doing it.
There you go. All right. Adam, I want to go back to something you said a few minutes ago, where you said that the config action system isn't destructive, like it's not going to remove config or uninstall a module. Wondering if you can elaborate on that. And the reason I'm asking this is because when I was playing with recipes, right, I was like, hey, I want to uninstall this module. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. And I couldn't find any like specific documentation on how to do that. So is that like an intentional thing that like, hey, config action systems like, no, you can't destroy that or uninstall that or anything?
Yeah, it's intentional that recipes and config actions don't let you remove stuff, generally speaking. There are a couple of cases where they do. The classic example is like if you want to remove something from a view display, right? You could do that because that's not really destructive. That's a very normal site building task. I want to hide this field, but in terms of things like deleting config entities or uninstalling modules or really permanently removing anything, config actions won't let you do that. Or it's not that they will actively prevent you. You could, in theory, write a config action to do that. You shouldn't, but you could. But the reason you shouldn't is precisely because of what I said before, where removing stuff means that anything coming after that can no longer rely. It can no longer rely on its own assumptions. It's like, oh, well, I was going to go modify this view, but it's gone now. So damn it, what am I supposed to do? Now I'm broken, and now anything that's going to build on top of me is broken. So that's really why they're meant to be additive. Now, that being said, I've had the question asked to me before where it's like, oh, a recipe installed this module. I don't want to do that. I want to undo that. How do I make a recipe to uninstall it? Usually my answer there is that points to the recipe that installed the thing is then doing too much. It's like, okay, that recipe should maybe be split up into smaller recipes that have fewer opinions so that you can build up what you want from smaller pieces. And that balance of finding out, like, how am I making a recipe that does too little or is it doing too much is sort of, I found that just something you just have to intuitively learn from experience. It's hard to figure out. But the cool thing is that recipes, they're not modules. They have no update path. So if you make a recipe and it turns out it's too big, you can just break it up. You will not affect any existing sites that have already used that recipe. You're free to change it however you want. So that I find it is really, really helpful.
Is there a way to
into it?
Is there a way to organize those that you're aware of on Drupal.org yet? I mean, my understanding is people are kind of just using module space for it, but like, have you seen a way that people have organized multiple recipes that are related into one project, like events, I suppose?
Shouldn't be doing that. So it's a very the way to have a recipe on Drupal.org is as a general project, which is even more. My understanding is that it's even more bare bones than a module. It's just it's a composer.json and some other stuff. And the way the recipe system was designed is that every recipe, so in a module, you can package multiple modules in one module, which is a weirdo Drupalism that causes some problems in some situations. Alex is shaking his head right now, just for those listening at home.
And it's so bad. The whole thing that a Drupal project can have multiple modules, and like Drupal composer required, Drupal / something can bring down multiple modules. It's so
yeah. So recipes don't.
Anyway, yeah.
And recipes do not allow this. Every recipe has to be its own little thing, its own little composer package, and it can only have one recipe in it. That's itself, and that's just how it is. So that's the way to organize recipes. Is you want to have a recipe? Great, make a general project or a GitHub repo, publish it on packages. That works too.
So I have a question to what you just said, right? So recipe is like a solo thing, right? But like recipes can reference other recipes, right? So like I'll give you my example use case that I used I did a couple of weeks ago, right? I was basically trying to get like my own custom install profile using a recipe, right? And originally what I was doing was I was starting with minimal, and then I was trying to like uninstall stuff, and ran into what Adam was saying, like, hey, don't do that, dummy. And then I reached out to Jim Birch, and he said, oh no, you can use a recipe as an install profile here, just do it like this. And I said, oh, okay. So I basically took the standard install profile and started from there and just kind of removed the bits that I didn't want from it, right? And at the top of that, it calls like a bunch of different recipes from core to install different things and do different stuff. So like that's okay, obviously, because that's happening in core, right? So like what's the differentiator there? What am I missing?
Like, why is it okay? Like it's always okay for a recipe to call on other recipes. That's how they're intended to work. They just can't ship multiple ones together. That's all. And so if you need to reference other recipes, those are just your regular dependencies. I just depend on these other recipes. You list them in composer.json in the require section, the same as you would if you required modules.
Got it. Okay. So they're just different. So there are no sub recipes is what you're saying.
That is exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Because I was like, wait a second, you can totally include other recipes. No sub recipes. We're not doing sub recipes here, which makes
Yeah.
a whole ton of sense. Because
Yeah.
anybody that's ever tried to track down a sub module dependency in a composer file is like, yay, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. Sub
There you
recipes
go.
are not a thing.
Got it. I'm up to speed. Like I said, fifth grader. And all the fifth graders are going to send me mean emails now. Like, you're definitely dumber than us. But anyway,
No, I think it's great. You just took people on the journey to understand why there are no sub recipes. You made it very clear.
Whew, all right.
Are we moving towards npm and installing like 600 packages
God.
now on a
hope not.
project?
Please
I mean,
no.
we shift the problem somewhere else, right? I'm saying this flippantly, but what I'm getting at is by not having submodules, you move the problem somewhere else, which is like if it has 10 dependencies of other recipes, right? Now, instead of having a monolith module, now you have 10 more packages to install in your build time.
Okay, so it's a fair question, but we have an answer for that. And the answer is no, we're not building packages, and we're not going to have the same problems. One, because recipes can't have code. So the whole like left pad of Drupal is not going to happen through a recipe. But secondly, we want to build, and someone has built, but we haven't yet brought it into Core, a composer plugin that when you require a recipe, doesn't actually add the recipe as a dependency to your project because you don't need it for build time. In order to deploy a recipe to production, you do exactly what you do now. You deploy your configuration. We don't want recipes to become this like new deployment tool. And so when you do a composer that requires a recipe that goes on to require 100 other recipes, you will not in your root composer JSON get 100 different recipes in there for you to have to maintain and think that you have to take on some upgrade path, because you don't. You get them at that moment, you apply them to your site instance at that moment, and you make they make the changes to your site. You're either happy with it or you're not, and you can roll back or whatever you want to do. But at the point when the recipe has been applied to your site, essentially you can throw it away.
I have a couple questions then about that before you move on, Nate. Is that going to be tied to if you say like the type is a recipe? Because I have clients that manage their own private packages for the custom modules that they release to multiple sites. I can see a lot of agencies developing their own recipes that they want to be able to require, so they're not going to be on Drupal.org. And that's usually pretty easy because you can just add additional repositories to Composer JSON, right? Is there going to be some sort of plugin that handles making sure that those recipes don't get committed to Composer JSON as well? Or is that specifically just Drupal.org functionality for recipes?
It's going to be based on the package type, which will be Drupal recipe. So
Great.
That's how I believe the current plugin works. And if it doesn't work like that, it will work like that, because there'd be no reason to not. Because yes, again, if you're an agency maintaining your recipes, and you want to use them on all your client projects, you don't want those recipes as part of the build on those projects.
Yep.
You manage your deployments in exactly the same way. Recipes are not looking to change that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And I mean, like at the very base level, right? That recipe is just applying modules and configuration that are in your repo that you're exporting through normal config export import, right? So like having those run every build is totally not necessary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there should be nothing that a recipe can do that you can't do via clicking through the UI or writing a series of extremely complicated trash commands.
We've all been there. So where did the config action system come from? I'm assuming it's through the journey of recipes, but I'd asked the question early on. Why not exporting a full config file? But where did this idea originate from to include it in core?
Alex knows. He invented it.
Where did it come from? It came out the need to build recipes that were going to be composable and not step on each other's foot. And in order to do that on top of Drupal's configuration system, which has a particular understanding of a whole config object, it was apparent that we needed something, an API to do that, and we needed an API that could react to declarations of intent rather than like a series of programmatic stuff. I didn't want the kind of choose your own adventure recipes was something I was trying to avoid. And it was inspired by my work on the configuration management initiative throughout the Drupal 8 cycle, and also by my work with Thunder CMS on that. They have a module called Update Helper, which tries to kind of like update configuration even when the sites have gone and done lots of different things. And so from the learnings of both that, it's like, okay, I know we need to build a system, but I don't want to make it part of recipes because I want to potentially use it in the Update Helper module or some other ideas in the future. So that's why it exists as a separate thing.
Okay. So what was the most complex part of building this new system?
Complex. I think that's hard to judge, but the most enjoyable part of building the new system, so I'm just going to do that classic kind of politician thing of like changing the question. The most enjoyable part was when we moved to have the base version of Drupal 10 on to PHP 8.1, which allowed us to have like a load of things to do with attributes working, and then the realization how nicely attributes and config actions would play together. And so it's really easy to turn like a method on your like specialized config entity class, like the role class, into a config action. You can just annotate it with like attribute it with the config action attribute, and then the system knows how to turn that into a config action that you can use in your recipes or in any other future system that someone else might build.
Yeah, I don't quite understand why, like, as somebody consuming these things, but attributes seem just so much cleaner than annotations, even though they're like basically there's a lot of differences, but like you're basically just putting something before something to identify it to the system. But attributes just feel so much cleaner.
Well, it has much better support in your development tools. It has native language support, and there's a really nice thing to do with translations and attributes compared to annotations. Like if you remember, in annotations you have to have like that at translation and stuff, and that's a kind of like further annotation inside your annotation. Whereas for attributes, you just use exactly what you would do in code, and you just go like new translatable markup, and it just creates the translatable markup object. And it's just beautiful because then there's no like layers of indirection. That it's amazing. Yeah,
Interesting.
Attributes are going to be great. I mean, I think we were talking about object-oriented hooks at in the kind of like pre-section of the show, and how much you guys are looking forward to that. And that's going to use attributes as well, and that's going to be lovely. Drupal 10. If you're upgrading a module to support Drupal 11, or you're thinking about like cutting a new version of a module, like moving your minimum dependency to 10.3 and using attributes, because a lot of the core plugin system now can support attributes. It's a good task. So make your minimum versions 10.3 and move to attributes. You will enjoy it if you do it.
Actually, I think, well, depending on which system you're converting, wasn't it Drupal 10.1 that first supported attributes? I think 10.1 can be the minimum, right?
Yeah, but most of the like plugin classes in core embedded in 10.3.
Fair enough. So what do you see as the future of the config action system? I mean, you already mentioned you built it specifically to be used outside of recipes. You mentioned the update helper, but what other kinds of use cases do config actions have, do you think?
Well, I think like an alternative way of like providing updates to config is something I think we might see from it. I think we might see people leverage it in changing some of like .install functionality, like hook install instead being in some kind of like config action file. Maybe, I don't know, like, but
Interesting.
but I could see that happening. But yeah, I'd be interested about exploring it for the update stuff.
Do you think that it's going to have any make any changes or have any impact on the current kind of config management system? Like, do you see any of the config action stuff kind of going back into that system? Or are you like, hey, listen, that thing is good, fine, great. Like, let's just leave it alone.
I don't know.
That's a perfectly okay answer. I think that I
think the space where it's most likely to have some really interesting developments is because it's the same for all kind of complex config problems. Pretty much every tool that gets written in and around config at some point will become part of a way to maintain multiple versions, near enough versions of the same site, but aren't quite the versions of the same site. And someone will build like some kind of config distro action thing that leverages it to like have like nearly identical sites, but with like minor differences. Just because that's the way of all interesting thing in config, it always ends up getting involved in that discussion.
I don't want to be the like harbinger of things here, but like that was kind of like my use case for the install profile. I was kind of like, how can we build a recipe that like I can duplicate a bunch of sites and then maybe build sub recipes that I can like only install on a couple of those sites? And like, I mean,
well, I think that recipes itself is definitely a way in which we're trying to reframe that problem. To say, actually, here is a set of things, and they can do a limited set of actions which are not destructive, which makes it much easier to do those things. And you can start from a recipe. You can have no Drupal install a recipe, and then add more recipes to it. And you could come up with a cookbook, which or even a tool outside of Drupal, which you go and select a load of recipes, and it will build you a Drupal site based on those recipes.
Right.
But we very much want people to look at these things and go, actually, maybe it allows us to reframe that problem, not doing it inside of Drupal, but maybe in a place where you're not trying to change the wings on your fighter aircraft whilst it's actually flying. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
With all the things
good idea.
All the things that have tried to do that in the Drupal world have all crashed.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where I see it being helpful for like, hey, let's add these functionalities in a safe dev space, and then let's push it to production once it's stable. Adam, if somebody wanted to like help with the config action system, like pick up an issue, learn more about it, like get involved, helping you guys out with what I imagine is a maybe a hefty backlog of things. Where could they do that? How could they do that?
That's a good question. It's probably the issues themselves are probably scattered around in core, the core issue queue, in the distributions and recipes issue queue, which I can send you a link for. What I've been enjoying from my perspective is seeing the ideas that people have for new config actions that are useful and helpful and accomplish like real goals. A really good example is what Martin came up with, which is an action to place a block in a theme. And we were able to take that and make this really flexible and really useful way to place a block in a theme where you have like a certain amount of, there's a certain number of options for making sure that it just can support a number of really good use cases. And also that it was easy to use, that it made sense. And that was just something that was really great to see, because like, of course we need something like this, of course this is useful. So, I love seeing that. I love seeing when people have ideas for new actions and seeing what I can do to help them get those actions actually committed to core, which I'm happy to do. So that's what I'd like to see personally. more people. And like, module maintainers, add config actions to your modules. I think it's safe to do that now. We have, the system seems pretty clear. And the more actions we have, the more recipes can do, and the more other things that end up leveraging config actions are able to do. So add, by all means, add more actions. And as Alex said, making an entity method into an action is a one-line change. So the time is now, I think.
I'm chuckling because I'm realizing that we haven't asked until now, like what config actions are provided by core. I mean, you mentioned the role stuff, but what config actions are currently available to use?
Well, there's documentation for that, but there's a lot of them actually, particularly in Drupal 11. So obviously roles are the classic example, or role permissions, I should say. Configuring entity view displays and entity form displays, adding components to those is also very useful. As I mentioned, Martin's place block action is fantastic. There's a really sort of no-brainer config action that changes simple config, and you can, where it's like changing settings of something. That's also, you can get a lot done with that. Yeah, I'm trying to think about, like, there was an issue that was committed that I helped write, and it was adding those it was taking a lot of the entity methods, the config entity methods in core config entities, and just turning them into config actions with that one line change that I mentioned. So there's quite a few, and I can't think of them off the top of my head, but they're definitely listed somewhere. One I will say that, like, one spot that's missing from core is the ability to change views, and that has mostly to do with the fact that views are, there's a bunch of words I could use, and they're not clean words, so I'm not going to use them. But views is scary.
I've had one of my first contributions was writing something that required a views config post update, and I learned about that function, and
it's frightening. It's really like an eldritch horror in there, and I'd love to see that get improved, where, like, if we had config actions in core that could change views in ways that really made sense. And that's kind of the challenge with views, where, like, there's literally thousands of fiddly little things you can do in a view, but what are the few things I can do that are really impactful, and how can I make them easy to use in config actions, and how can I represent just a really useful action in a way that makes sense. So making views more config actionable would be really cool. If anybody, has the stomach for it. I don't.
I actually have, you sparked another question, and this is from my own tinkering with recipes and config actions, right? So you just talked about the config action to kind of like place a block, right? Which was in my first testing, playing with recipes, was the problem that I was having, was like, how do I get this block to show up like in this page, right? Figured that out. That was fine, worked great. My next thing that I'm going to try to do is around layout builder. Am I going to be able to do that, or is that just going to be like a road of pain? And what I mean by that is basically creating block types and then kind of like placing them into a piece of content where, like, hey, I have an example piece of content that gets shipped with my my recipe.
Like, place them into a piece of content that's using layout builder?
Yeah, exactly.
That's another one that would really benefit from some dedicated config actions that doesn't have any, because, as you point out, adding something to layout builder, like, there's a lot that goes into that. And so if layout builder had dedicated config actions for that, I think that would be really beneficial. So it's another one worth writing.
Interesting. So are you saying that it might be impossible for me to do that with a recipe, or that I would just really have to like try real hard?
I think that you could do it with a recipe now if you did some hacky things that you shouldn't do.
Got it.
It's definitely, that's like a classic example of something that just cries out for a config action so that a recipe can actually add something to a layout builder layout coherently.
Yeah. It makes it easier. Yeah, right. Okay, cool. Thanks. I'm glad I asked, because now I won't bang my head on it for, days at a time.
Sure.
Just to answer one of the questions about where should people start if they want to know more about the config action API, there isn't any real dedicated space for it, because it's just part of the config API, and it's very much at the moment viewed as part of recipes. So the best place to ask questions if you're unsure, it would be to come to Drupal Slack and go to the recipes channel, because the people there are the people who've done most work on it.
Okay. John, your question confused me a bit. So you can't create content with config actions. You're just managing config.
Well,
correct?
yeah, right. So fair. So the content creation piece actually comes from recipes, which I think is actually a submodule, not a submodule. Sorry, an additional module that allows you to export content as config, and then you import that content with a recipe if you ship it with your recipe.
Exporting content as config. What is this sorcery?
Adam's head turned sideways when you were talking.
Wait, 1 second. Let me clear this up because I can. So actually, the recipes initiative added 4 APIs to core: the recipes API, which we mentioned, the config actions, which this course mostly being focused on, the config checkpoint. But there's also the default content API, which was ripped 100% out of the fabulous contrib project called default content. And we ripped out the config importing API in order to allow recipes to create content whilst they were being applied. And so in order to get recipes into content into your recipes, it's advisable to use the contrib module default content to export the content, and then you can put that in your recipe and it will know how to import it. But it doesn't need the default content module in order to create that, because that code is in core now. And eventually we might be looking to build way more functionality on top of that default content stuff, because it's useful for many more cases than just recipes.
That's what my question is around, was like export content with layout builder, import content with layout builder.
So it depends on how you're going to struggle at the moment, because you've got the classic problem of like your content containing config. So it's all going to be pain at the moment. And if I was looking to manage layouts in recipes, I wouldn't use content specific layouts. I would provide a layout as configuration and use that in my content, because then I can manage the layout as configuration, not as a blob inside a content entity, because there's nothing for that at the moment. And it will be a really hard problem space.
Good to know. All right. Well, I will put that POC on the shelf and pick it up again in like, I don't know, a month or two. We'll see. We'll just keep an eye on it.
Or just build your layout in config and provide it as a layout that can then be managed by a recipe, and not do like the per content layout stuff. And
got it.
And if you think about it, per content layout really is a very, very specific thing. And it's fine for your content to ship with per content layouts in a recipe, right? And it's fine for it to for that per content layout to depend on blocks that your recipe could place, or the recipes that
right.
But
I see.
To have a config action then come in and manipulate that config that's buried in content, nah.
So do the layout in the layout and export that and have it and then turn on the pre-content with the recipe after the fact, and let people do their thing. Got it.
Or just or do what I said, which is like, and make sure that everything you use in your layout that you've embedded in your content is provided by your recipe, and then you can place a block in there because it's there,
right?
And then so when you turn on the recipe, it'll work, but there's no config action there, because that config isn't config in the Drupal terms,
right?
Yeah, to be clear, config actions can only work on config entities. They cannot work on content entities in any way, shape, or form, regardless of what they have in them.
Yeah. Thank you for clearing up that confusion. Appreciate it. It looks like I have the last question, but I'm sure John will have about 3 more after I do. So how important is the config actions system in relation to using it in Starshot? I, throughout the show, was perusing the issue queue, Adam, and I noticed an issue that you had put in, and there's a label on it that says Starshot blocker in terms of config actions and recipes.
Well, Starshot blocker is a tag that I just use anytime I think I might want to yell at somebody to commit something because it's important for Starshot, maybe. So it's rather loose. But I mean, config actions are critical to Starshot because Starshot is built entirely on recipes. I'm sorry, Drupal CMS is the official name. We can call it by its name. But yeah, it's a whole set of recipes built together. So config actions are very much are the magic sauce in it. And so having a lot of really good config actions is critical to Drupal CMS being good.
But I'm really excited personally to start using recipes and start using config actions. The gears in my brain are turning, especially on that particular client that I had mentioned earlier, and my pain of distributing configuration changes across 18 websites that share the same code base without config management. I'm sure I'm not the only one here. I've done this. I've had this similar problem with many clients over the last decade. So I think it's a really good example of solving a problem, aka recipes and Drupal CMS, but you're also solving some like auxiliary issues that a lot of developers that work in an agency format or with clients probably deal with every single day. So, and it's very exciting to see how this system can be used outside of recipes in the future.
I mean, yeah, some of the initial kind of thoughts on recipes were born out from clients of mine who are going like, hey, we really want to support Drupal commerce and we want to be able to like supply configurations for like every single Drupal commerce site, and how can we get it to all work together? They should be trying to get this into Kickstart. And I'm like, well, if you get it into Kickstart, that's only new sites. Should we put it in a module? And it's like, well, then you have to support it forever and you have to provide upgrade paths. That doesn't really feel like what you want to do here. What it feels like is you want to be able to supply like best practice config. Like, how could we do that to all these sites? And so yeah, recipes has come out is an answer to that problem of how do we ship like the same feature to a n number of sites, and whether or not they are directly related, as your client sites probably are, or they're not related at all. We want recipes to be able to be like a possible solution to that, and hopefully one that could less pain than any of the others.
Yeah, I think this might bring distributions back. I mean, it has that potential. I use
not if we call
heavily.
them distributions, because that'll send people running for the hills.
Yeah, maybe it needs a new name, but the idea
it's called
behind
recipes.
Yeah, I think the idea behind them will come back, because having like those built like COD was great for building a Drupal camp, except for all the pieces that you didn't want, and keeping it up to date with security updates, right? With recipes, you get the functionality, keep what you want, get rid of what you don't, and then you're just maintaining a Drupal site from that point on. So I'm really excited about recipes. I'm almost equally excited about single directory components. I think the future is bright. I'm looking forward to seeing how this comes together in Drupal CMS. But so Adam, before we close out, any final thoughts on Drupal CMS? Maybe that, since you're kind of in a lead position there, anything that you would like to shout out or get some attention on while you're here?
I'm merely the technical octopus of Drupal CMS. But I mean, I think the only shout out I would give is to the amazing work being done by the track leads, developing the features that are going to go into the initial release. They've been doing really, really, really incredible work, and just seeing them being able to bring their expertise to bear on this thing, and building it as recipes and seeing how actual recipes are being actually built for real sites has been really cool, because I don't build sites. So I think I'll give them a shout out, and to the rest of the leadership team, and watch for a lot of Starshot stuff in Barcelona. I'm sorry, Drupal CMS stuff. Starshot's cooler. Yeah, watch for a lot of cool stuff in Barcelona, and for just as things continue to evolve there. And it's a very fast moving project. So what we have this week, we may have a bunch of exciting stuff next week too.
Just start saying Drupal CMS codename Starshot.
Yeah, codename Starshot.
Makes it sound secretive and appealing.
Yeah. So yeah,
All right.
I appreciate that.
Awesome. And any final thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, I want to shout out to Adam and all the people working on Drupal CMS. It's super exciting to see like recipes being adopted and built upon, and to build like something that's going to definitely change the way in which people experience Drupal, and hopefully also like provide stuff for all the agencies and other people building their own kind of like tweaked versions of CMS. And that's just, it's really nice to see. I would also like to shout out to Jim Birch from Canopy, like other co-lead on the Recipes initiative. He's not as developer focused as Adam and me, but he's really helped us like get recipes in delivered and into 10.3. He was fantastic help. And it's like, if you're not a technical person and you want to contribute to Drupal core or Drupal initiatives, like seeing what Jim has done on the initiative is a great way to show that people who are maybe not like have years of Drupal core experience can actually do really good roles and get really involved. It's great. And I'd also like to say thanks to all the other contributors to the Recipes initiative. We've had quite a few over the couple of years that it's been going, and they've all made a difference. And thanks for having us.
No problem. As well, and thank you, Alex and Adam, for joining us to talk about config action systems. I think we need to subtitle the show "Recipes" because we spent a fair amount of time talking about recipes, but it makes sense because they're directly related. So thanks for joining us.
And as a programming note, Jim Birch will be joining us in 3 weeks to walk us through creating a recipe only using his voice. So that'll be very interesting show where he's not going to be able to show any visuals, but tell us how to build a recipe.
He has a great voice.
Fabulous. Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. You can learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo. Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter. And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. All right, Alex, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, had any questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
Drupal Slack is the best way to get in touch with me. Probably in a public channel is best. The Recipes channel, core development, contribute, definitely the best place. Or just on Drupal.org, like in an issue.
Awesome. And Adam, how about you?
Same place. I am in Drupal Slack, in the Starshot channel, the Recipes channel, this channel, that channel. My handle is Fennaproxima. I'm happy to talk to you.
Awesome. And Nate, how about you?
I'll first off by saying I dropped my phone number in last week's episode and no one texted me. So I'm slightly disappointed. But you can get a hold of me at on Drupal Slack. Nathan Denzau is the handle. Email nathan@denzau.com. No phone number this week. We'll see how the experiment goes.
All right. And John, how about you?
I feel like I'm going to text Nate later. I am John Picozzi on all the major social networks, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.